Hello, welcome to Heartfelt Crochets by Darlene. Today I want to share with you 10 crochet tips that I find helpful. I feel that if you are a beginner crocheter that you might be running into a few of these problems and that you will find them helpful too. So let's go ahead and I will let you in on my secret of 10 crochet tips. And I find them extremely helpful. And they end up solving a lot of problems that as a beginner you may run into. So I've gone ahead and I've prepared some different swatches with different colors that I'm going to be using. And we are going to start with this green one. I went ahead and I created this with a tight chain stitch. It's kind of going at a little bit of a curve, and just because the chain is tighter than the rest of the stitches, and that's very common, especially if you're just learning how to crochet. There are two things that you can do for this, and this is my first tip. You can either go either a half size or a full size larger, depending on what your tension is. And then for your next rows, go back down to the size that you need to use for your pattern. Now, the other thing that you can do is just try to loosen up on your tension when it comes to the chain. If you are a new beginner crocheting, lots of times you'll tend to want to make that stitch really tight so that you can barely pull that hook through. Okay, instead of doing that, try to keep that loop a little loose and pull it up a little bit each time you make a chain. That's going to keep that chain much looser, and it will give you that really tight curve at the beginning. All right, so for tip number 2, using this same swatch, I want you to take notice that out of these 2 rows, look at the holes at the end of the rows. I'm going to take out this row and I'm going to show you how to avoid that. Let's go ahead and take this row out, and I'm going to show you what you should do to avoid those holes. Okay, so we're going to take it all the way down to you just worked that first row. Now, instead of chaining 3, we are just going to chain 1, and we're going to turn. Now, if you would have chained 3, it would have counted as your first double crochet, and you would have worked your next double crochet in this stitch here. We are going to, like I've always said in all of my tutorials, we are going to work the very first stitch in this very first spot here. Okay, so we've only chained 1 instead of chain 3. We're turning, and we are going to double crochet in that very first space. That's going to close in that hole. And then you would continue your work down that row. Okay, so we're down to the last 2 stitches of this row. We're going to double crochet in this next stitch. Now, the previous row was to be just double crochet in the chain 3 space. No, like I've always said in the tutorials before, turn your work and see this little V right here? You are going to want to crochet your stitch into that little V. That's not going to be in here pulling that hole. It's going to give you a nice straight edge. So now you have edges that don't have your holes. Okay, now I'm going to go one step further with stitch markers. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab an extra stitch marker here. I'm supposed to have 2 and I had only grabbed out 1. And while I have this little kit out grabbing my stitch markers, if you're just starting out and you don't have all the different size crochet hooks, and you don't have the darning needles, and you don't have the pair of scissors and your stitch markers, I got this little kit of Yarnus on Amazon. I found it for like 15 bucks, and it has come in really handy. I mean, I have a whole slew of other crochet hooks as well, but it was time for something new, and I decided that I was just going to go ahead and I was going to pick this up and give it a try. And some people say they don't like the crochet hooks, but I myself, I find them just fine. They work just great. So I'll go ahead and I will put the link below in case you want to go ahead and purchase one of these little kits to get started. All right, so I have 2 stitch markers here. Now, tip number 3 is a lot of people, when they're first starting out crocheting, they miss the very first stitch and they miss the very last stitch. And for some reason, they can't figure out why their work is kind of like going like this. Or sometimes it's just the opposite. Sometimes they add a stitch and it comes out this way. So this is what we're going to do with the stitch markers until you get used to knowing where the first and the last stitch is, okay? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to chain 1, and we're going to turn our work, and we're going to double crochet into that first stitch like we did in the row before. This time we are going to go ahead, take a stitch marker, and place it in that first stitch, okay? Now we're going to go ahead and double crochet all the way across again to the end of the row. Now we're at the last stitch, and we're going to go ahead and we are going to crochet our double crochet under that V. And then in this last stitch, we are going to place our other stitch marker. Okay. So now when we turn our work, we are going to chain 1, and we're going to turn. And the stitch marker is now showing us that we need to go into this first stitch. Don't skip it and go into the next one. See, that'll help prevent you from skipping a stitch. And then when you get to the end of the row, this stitch marker is telling you that this isn't your last stitch, and not to go in that chain 3 space, but to go in to that last V as your last stitch. And your work will be straight. You won't be missing any stitches. For tip number 4, I am going to crochet a chain of 20. 19, 20. And we're going to go ahead and crochet a row of single crochets. So that would be an extra chain. A normal way of just crocheting into a chain is right in the front of the chain. Now I'm going to go ahead and do this for the first half of this chain, but then I am going to switch to the tip number 4, crocheting on the back side of this chain. So if you flip your chain over, you are going to see these little bumps on the back of your chain. We are going to go underneath that little bump instead of the front of the chain and crochet our single crochets under there. So you would just insert your hook underneath that little bump and make a single crochet, and into the next one, and then into the next one. In the first half of the chain, it's just a nice straight thin edge. To the left is a little bit thicker, of where we single crocheted into the back side of the chain. And look at the difference on the bottom. You can see where the V is on the bottom of these stitches, which matches the V's on the top. Okay, so this comes in extremely handy if you are making squares to join together, afghan or scarf. It makes it much easier to be able to join. Okay, now for tip number 5. I've gone ahead and I have crocheted a row of double crochets. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to pull up our loop about as tall as what we would have for a double crochet. Turn our work, hold the top of that loop tight. Now insert your hook into the very first stitch, pull up a little tiny loop and hold it tight and draw through a loop. This is where it gets tricky. Now you're going to take your hook and you're going to wrap it around that big loop. And now you have 2 loops on the hook, and you've made that little bit of a twist that looks like a double crochet, and pull through those 2 loops. And then you would go ahead and just proceed and crochet as usual. And instead of having a chain 3, it looks like you have double crochets right straight across. Now tip number 6, I went ahead and I crocheted this swatch of 2 rows of single crochets, 2 rows of half double crochet, 1 row of double crochet, and then 1 row of treble crochet. Now the reason I did that is because sometimes if you're making a scarf or an afghan and you want to create a single crochet border around the whole entire thing when you're finished, a lot of people don't quite know how to put that border around in these holes. Sometimes there are times that I will end up going just into the side, but very seldom do I do that. There's very few reasons why I would do that, but today we're not going to be doing that. I've already crocheted this single crochet border on this top side, and now we're working down the side. So for treble crochet, you would work 3 single crochets in that space. So we would chain 1 for a corner, and then 3 single crochets. And then you would go ahead, and if there was a next row of trebles, you would do 3 single crochets. Okay, so if your work is all double crochets, you would do 2 single crochets in each one of those spaces across. Half double crochets. The reason why I ended up crocheting 2 rows is because if you have work that is all rows of half double crochet, then you would want to work 1 in the next row and 2 in the next row. Okay, now for single crochet rows, just 1. It's easy as that. Just 1 single crochet in each one of those rows across, and you'll have a nice even border. Then you would just continue down around the opposite side and do the same on this side. So rule of thumb to remember, that being 1 single crochet in rows that are single crochet. For 2 rows of half double crochets, it would be 1 single crochet and then 2 single crochets in the next row. For a row of double crochets, it would be 2 single crochets in the space of that row. And for treble crochets, it would be 3 single crochets in the space of the treble. Now for tip number 7, I went ahead and I crocheted this round. I crocheted 4 rows of this round, and I have 1 stitch left of an increase, and this is where I am going to join my second color, and I'm going to go ahead with this yellow. And I wanted to show you how to seamlessly join a second color without cutting the yarn and tying a knot. Okay, so I would go ahead, single. So 1, and then 2, only I wouldn't finish that, drawing that last loop through. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just fold the yarn in half, pull a loop through those 2. Then I would remove my stitch marker. And would just continue my work. And it gives you just seamlessly changes in to the next color. That brings me to the next tip of crocheting over your yarn tail. We've just joined this color. To save having to weave it in at the end, just hold that color in the back of that row as you're crocheting. Crochet right over it. It's going to save you a really big step of having to weave in the ends. Okay. However, with it just going one direction, it can very easily pull out. That's why we like to go back in the opposite direction. So even though you've crocheted over it, make sure you don't crochet over all of it. Leave a little bit of a tail still to go back the opposite direction with your darning needle. And then you would simply feed your darning needle and pull your yarn through. And now it's totally secure and you can go ahead and you can cut your yarn. Tip number 9, we are going to create an invisible decrease. We're crocheting along. We're making single crochets and then it calls for a decrease. Most common decrease is to insert your hook and pull up a loop, insert the hook in the knit stitch, pull up a loop, and then pull through all 3. But that turns out to be a very obvious looking decrease. See, it bunches up. Okay, so let's pull that out. And we are going to insert our hook under the very first loop and then put the hook under the very front of the second loop. Pull through those 2 and then yarn over and pull through those 2 and then continue crocheting. Now see, it's much cleaner. There's no bump. You don't see 2 stitches together. Called an invisible decrease. All right, and then last but not least, tip number 10 is an invisible join. Now I went ahead and I ended up getting that caught up for some reason. I don't know how that happened. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut the yarn right here. We're done our row. We are going to pull our yarn through, feed our darning needle. Now we're going to insert our hook into the back side of the next loop. Then we are going to feed our hook into the front side of that stitch that we just made. And we're going to pull it snug. And that, again, avoids a knot being made at the end of the row. And you would just go ahead and you'd weave in your ends, and it's nice and smooth and clean. If you liked these 10 crochet tips, please give me a thumbs up. If you would like to see more videos like this one, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified of any upcoming videos that you might be interested in. Until next time, bye!